So my name is David Ealy. I'm the pastor at Hawfields Presbyterian Church and a current pastor at Hawfields Presbyterian Church. Was a military brat. My dad was in the Army, and with all the moving around, ended up in the Presbyterian Church, which is where I eventually entered seminary. Got married to a woman I met at seminary, and 2 churches ago, learned a whole lot about doing ministry before I ended up here at Hawfields.
Okay, can we get into government and how the Constitution is similar, and like how it's...
So, yeah, well, first of all, the Presbyterian Church, one of the major differences between denominations, right, is how they're governed. So in an Episcopal system, bishops kind of rule the day. They direct where priests go. They basically command how churches are organized, who can do what, who can go where. And so in the Roman Catholic Church, the chief bishop, of course, is the Pope. But then you have archbishops, you have, the head of diocese and that kind of thing. And in a local church, the priest basically rules all. I mean, all decisions go through them and so on. The Episcopal Church is the same way, actually, in a lot of ways. In a Baptist church, they're actually more similar to a Roman Catholic church than they probably like. But, the pastor, again, is in charge until he does something the congregation doesn't like, and then the deacon board steps in. In a Presbyterian church, and it's the name Presbyterian, weird as it may sound, actually comes from the Greek, presbyteros, which means elder. It's set up to take seriously a couple of things. One, that in order to discern God's will, then we need to do it together. The other thing that is a part of our conviction is that since we are all sinners, no one person has a monopoly on what God has to say. And so, again, we have to do that together. And then the third thing is that we only have one bishop, and that's Jesus Christ. Christ alone is the head of the church. And so all of us really are servants. In our local church, there are a lot of things that I'm responsible for as the pastor, but I'm considered an elder, and I am a member of what we call the session, which is basically the board of our church. And the session and me, we are all, and I guess I should say, we are all elected by the congregation. And it's confirmed by the presbytery, which is a grouping of churches. Our region happens to be called Salem. Used to be called Orange, and that was actually the presbytery we eventually became a part of when this church was organized, because there were no presbyteries when it started. I mean, that's how far back it goes. But because we elect those folks, and that's a part of our process for discerning God's call, the session is in charge of everything that happens in the name of our church, with 2 exceptions. One, the congregation reserves the right to elect its leadership, and 2, reserves the right to deal with the property of the church. So because of that, there are limits to what the session can do. There are limits to what I can do, and so on. Where it gets to be similar to the way our United States government is organized is because we elect our leaders. Everybody in Congress, the president, we elect all those folks. But unlike Congress, or the president for that matter, where they're supposed to be beholden to the voters, their constituencies, all the citizens, our constituency is Christ alone. So even though the congregation votes for us and puts us in office, we don't really answer to them. We're supposed to answer to God. Now, let's be real, right? If I do something that the congregation doesn't like, that can cause a lot of trouble, and, form of government aside, probably won't be here long. But at the same time, the way our government is structured is set up to protect us from having to deal with mob rule. So in other words, if we feel like God's moving us in one direction, but everybody just doesn't like it, that's not a reason to not do that, because we're supposed to be following God's direction. So, anyway, that's how it works.
Okay, can you tell me about how this church, like, they allowed to worship in the same place, and how, like, other churches in the area didn't, as I understand?
Over 1755, it's a long time, right? And so this church saw a lot of changes, none the least of which was the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, and so on. And predating that, of course, this church had to deal with the subject of slavery. We even have pictures in our historical room of this church that show the slave entrance to the sanctuary. The balcony in the sanctuary was set up to be the slave gallery, and the conviction was that we all needed to worship in the same place. Because, when I first got here and I saw it, I thought, oh, great, the slave gallery. But, I mean, it really was kind of phenomenal, because for a lot of the churches in the South, the common practice was to have them in their own space. But because of the conviction that we all needed to be worshiping in the same place, they set the gallery up. Eventually, of course, that entrance got closed up. Nowadays, they call that the cheap seats. And, any old body can sit up there. There was a time where men and women were to worship separately. There was a divider right up the middle of the sanctuary. And it was there for a long time. In fact, if you go to Old Salem, you can see a church there that still has one. It's kind of interesting. But at some point, if you read the minutes, it's kind of mundane. They were like, this is dumb. We're going co-ed. And so they did. They removed the barrier. Then we started worshiping. Men and women, didn't matter what side they were on. Those things seem small, but I mean, those were deliberate decisions that kind of smacked in the face of the current conventional wisdom of the day. And so, in some respects, this church was really kind of a pioneer. And that's a lot of the history of the Presbyterian Church in this country. They're kind of slow pioneers. They're not necessarily going to be on the cutting edge, but once they do get in the fight, they're in all the way, and they are a juggernaut. When the abolition movement, which got started by the Quakers, started rolling, it took us a while to get on board, but then we got on board. When the Civil Rights Movement happened, we weren't so hot about that at first. But eventually, once we got on board, we were in all the way. That's one of the, blessings and the curses of how we go about doing our decision making. Because it's so deliberate, because we do it together, it moves slow. But once it moves, then we're in. We're a force. We're in.
Okay, so this is an elementary question, but I think it's important. What does the minister do?
Nothing. No, I'm kidding. This is going to sound like we're playing semantics, but let's just so that we're clear. In our system, everyone's a minister. Everybody has a responsibility to minister. My particular job is as pastor. And in our system, there are lots of versions of that. There's an associate pastor, there's a pastor for families, there's the pastor for whatever. But here at Hawfields, my job is to help administer and supervise the staff, the church staff. So that includes our educator, our musicians, the office administrator and bookkeeper, treasurer, and so on. I'm responsible for those folks. Responsible for supporting them, but as well as kind of holding their feet to the fire with their job description. The other responsibility I have is pastoral care. It's my job to go around and to visit with folks and to be with them in times, sometimes of celebration, but most of the time in times of crisis. So, for example, today, I'm dressed like this because we had a funeral today. I had to meet with the family, talk with them about their loved one, decide how the funeral was going to be shaped, and then do that. One of the big pieces of my job, obviously, is both directing worship and preaching. And one of the things that our Book of Order says that I'm principally responsible for is choosing the music, which I think is odd, and choosing what scriptures we use. While the session really, as a whole, is in charge of every worship service that happens under our roof, they can't tell me what to preach. They can try, but I don't have to do that. that freedom is really important because, what if God wants us to go in a different direction and it's not popular? Remember civil rights, removing the divider, the slave gallery, and so on. I mean, all those things didn't start out, yay, we're going to be cutting edge. I mean, it was a fight. And so those are some of the pieces I'm responsible for. The other is teaching, trying to keep up with not just the Bible, but with current thought or current thinking and how churches go and on all the rest of it, and trying to share that and trying to help folks to embrace it and move forward. And, that's not always easy.
Right. And I think a lot of people confuse the job of the preacher to like a president, but I think it's more similar to a governor or just someone lower.
Well, it might be more similar to a city manager.
Really?
Well, because I'm not a CEO.
Right.
And you're right, I'm not a president. And we actually do have a president of our corporation, but I'll tell you about that in a second. I'm really not in charge.
So you're like a mayor.
You mean like Mebane City Mayor? Maybe that may be so, but no, because your typical mayor, like all decisions kind of go through him to a point. That's not true here. This couple wanted to get married here, but they weren't members of the church. I can't just say, yeah, we'll do that. I got to run that by the session. Yeah. Or when the DOT wanted to go and install those turning lanes, but they need to cut off some of our land, I couldn't just sign the papers and say, yeah, we're going to do that. The session had to deal with that. And so, when someone comes in and says, I think we need to do X, that's nice, but you ought to come to the session and talk about that. Even when people want to become members, I can't just say, poof, you're a member. The session's got to do that. Part of that is to recognize that power shouldn't be so centralized that we lose sight of who the real head of our church is. It's supposed to be Jesus Christ.
Right.
If you want to name a CEO, okay, well, he's it. But all of us, again, are servants. And my role is pretty specific. Now, because people are coming to us from churches that aren't Presbyterian, some of them do have a model where the priest is the CEO. And so they come with those expectations of me. And then get frustrated when I'm not doing that. But that's not how we work.
So there was a peak in population in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. Why do you think this?
For a couple of things. So our church, right, for a long time was a rural church, which meant we were surrounded by farms. Mm-hmm. And our population literally was sexed into the future because all of our members were families, right? Mm-hmm. Big families. Their daddies went here, their granddaddies went here, their grandmamas went here, their aunts went here, the brothers and sisters went here, their children would go here, and so on. I mean, it was a generational thing. So you had that piece. And then you add to that, really, just before the time period you named, if you wanted to go to the social center of a community, especially around here in the South, it was the church. I mean, because this is where the voting precinct was. This is where you went to have your town hall meetings. This is where you went to go do your civic activities. I mean, everything happened here. By extension, there was a lot of expectation that people would be in church. Culturally, if you were successful, part of your resume needed to include that you were part of a church and a leader in a church. We didn't have to try very hard to get folks in here because there were already a lot of motivation to get folks in here, and so they came. But as time moved forward, the culture changed, as well as the number of places where our attentions started to get divided. If I wanted to go to, say, a town meeting, now I go to City Hall or to the Mebane Arts Center, right? I don't have to go here. Or so, if I'm going to go vote, well, I don't vote here anymore. I vote at the middle school. Right. And when we've got activities, the church isn't the only game in town. In fact, sometimes the church isn't even the best game in town. I'll see people go to the Durham Performing Arts Center to see something, at night, and then complain about not wanting to come to a night event here because they don't want to drive at night. So, I mean, the culture's changed. And coming to church isn't as fashionable or stylish or as much of a status symbol as it used to be. And so between that and the fact that, frankly, our particular congregation is out of practice with actually having to do real evangelism, yeah, our population is lower than it used to be.
Can you define evangelism?
Sure. The word evangelism comes from the Greek, just like presbyteros. It literally means good news telling. And that really is it. I mean, that's what it's supposed to be. Over time, it has generally come to mean trying to convince people to join the church. And depending on what church you're talking to, it also has come to name a certain style of theology, evangelicalism, which, for me, ironically, even though it's supposed to mean good news telling, really means judgmental bashing. Because, you know, that particular bent of theology says, you know, if you don't believe this way and if you don't do these certain things, you are not in the club. Okay, but that wasn't Jesus' style. That wasn't what he preached. And so for us, good news telling means telling the good news of Jesus, his life, his ministry, and what Jesus did to affect our salvation, to make it happen. That's the good news. I don't have to have you buy into that for it to be true. It is true. And I don't have to know everything there is to know about it in order to talk to you about it, because I'm never going to understand all there is to know about it. So,
from the letter from Birmingham, this is the quote. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. And like, with this in mind, what do you see for the future? What does that statement mean to you?
Well, you got to consider that was written in the 60s.
Yeah.
And he could have been writing that today. I mean, because it's true. One of the things that I think is really killing the church is that we've lost our authenticity. We've lost our prophetic voice. And what that means is our willingness to put our necks out to say, I'm sorry, but this isn't right. You know, to stand up for making things better and for the principles that really are in the Bible. I mean, it's interesting to me, a lot of the bellyaching people do about some things and then gloss over things that Jesus was really specific that we should have been up to. And you know, it's not new. I mean, these were things that God said we should have been up to from the beginning. Taking care of our widows, looking after the poor, being honest in our transactions with one another. I mean, those are the three things the prophet spoke about the most, and yet it's the one thing that gets ignored in all of our policy debates, in our inter-church debates. I mean, what do we get concerned about? What do we get involved with? So it's no wonder that millennials and the youth are like, so why do I need to go to church? You know, because we're not doing the things that he was talking about in that letter. You know, we should be doing so. You know, it's important that we do things like addressing hunger needs in our community, housing needs in our community. It's important that we address the economic disparity in our community. And if we're going to say we're open and that we're inclusive, then we need to be open and inclusive. You know, we can't be these homogenous rocks of demographics, you know, in every congregation. Black, white, Latino, you name it. We're supposed to be diverse. And by the way, that idea is as old as the Tower of Babel. Mm-hmm. You know, God made us diverse, didn't like us being homogenous. And that was, you know, way back. You don't have to go back that far to get God wanting us to do things differently. And so if we don't actually tend to the things that God wants us to tend to, then of course we're going to fall into irrelevancy. Because all we're going to do is look like everyone else. And we're going to act like everyone else. And there's no reason to go to the church for any kind of distinction, you know, or to move to a different level. You know, one of the things you got to love about King and his work is that it's rooted in his theology that pours out of the Bible and what he finds there. And it's just kind of hard to argue with. But it didn't keep people from arguing with him. In fact, they shot him. So,
right.
Go figure. And by the way, they really didn't mess with him much until he started messing with the money. He railed about race, he railed about all this stuff, but the second he started messing around with the economic fortunes of people, like the boycotts, like some of the sit-ins and all that other kind of stuff, drew the attention of the FBI, drew the attention of all these other people, and he got assassinated. So, is the church willing to take shots in order to stand up for what's right? That's his question, and that's our question now. But we'll see. Because one thing you can't say about our church, bringing me here in this time was taking a shot. And we did. Because we lost like 30% of the congregation in bringing me here. But I mean, they thought that it was the right thing to do. On the one hand, do we have some work to do? Yes. But on the other hand, is that same pioneering spirit still alive? Thank God, yes.
No, I think we have to answer that question fairly soon.
We have to answer that question today.
Yeah.
So this church has had the benefit of having had a couple of governors, senator, but even with that high profile membership, they've always sort of flew under the radar. And that's good and bad, but this church hasn't tried to be something that it's not. And that's really important. You know, they've tried to be true to their identity and who they are. And I think we could all learn a lesson from that. The other thing that I remember is, I was looking through the membership books, especially the older ones. And, of course, was reading, about one of the pastors here, and it's, of course, lists his family, and then it lists his slaves.
Right.
And I remember looking at it and thought, oh, that's great,
Yeah.
But then it occurred to me, why list the slaves? Why are their names in the membership book? Pastor Henry Patillo, Susie Patillo, and there was John, Jake, and Nancy Patillo, the children. Then there was the table that belonged to the Patillos, this chair, and this horse. None of those things were in the book. They were property. And yet their names are in the membership book. So, whatever we want to say and, whatever lens we want to apply from our, 21st century mindset to theirs, when we look through their lens, I don't know. I think they were really pushing some of the edges. This is a great quote from Letter from Birmingham Jail. So what made you do that?
I read it in AP English this year.
I mean, it's something, right?
Yeah. And it, when I first read it, I was like, isn't that supposed to say 21st century?
Yeah, I know. But the same principles are in play.
Yeah.
I mean, people need to ask, am I voting the way God really wants me to vote? And, if you ask people, honestly, they're going to tell you, okay, well, no.
Yeah. And that's just one part of participation.
There is, yeah, right. It's one part of it. But it's a pretty important part of it because it's public and because it affects the lives of everybody else. If you put somebody unscrupulous in office, why do you expect to get scrupulous things? And, at the end of the day, if Jesus himself were on the ballot, nobody would vote for him. No one. I mean, come on.
Because he's like...
Turn the other cheek? That's a great military policy.
Yeah.
Or, sell all you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me. No one's signing up for that tax plan. And so, the reality on the ground is, so where does our practice of our faith fit in? I mean, you're right. It can't just be the voting part. It's also got to be what we do on the ground. And there's a lot that the church should be up to that we aren't.